At first glance, everything seemed fine. The mornings were still slow and golden. The pines outside our cabin whispered the way they always had, with that dry rustle that comes just before the light seeps in. I made the coffee in the blue enamel pot Thomas liked best, though the handle had chipped. He never minded small things breaking. Said it gave them character. Our life had grown quiet with age. We didn't speak much during breakfast. Just the sound of the spoon circling the bowl, the crossword folded between us, the occasional murmur when a clue reminded him of something from college. A four-letter word for faith, he once said, tapping his pen. You. He had been diagnosed with heart failure 3 months earlier. The kind the doctor described as inexorably terminal. I remember the phrase because I repeated it in my head for days. But when we left the clinic, Thomas patted my hand and said, "Don't cry yet. I'm not done watching you make tea." I didn't cry. I moved the guest bed into the living room so I could sleep near his recliner. I sorted his pills into little boxes labeled with days, canceled my book club, and stopped going into town unless I absolutely had to. He whispered to me one night, barely audible, "I'm glad it's you." I kissed the top of his hand, the skin paper thin now, and whispered back, "Always." That same night, I texted Dean and Natalie. Just asked if they could come soon, even for a weekend. No drama. No urgency. Just, "Your dad would love to see you." Dean wrote back the next morning, "We're swamped, Mom. Let's check in next month, okay?" Natalie didn't write at all. That's when the crack appeared. Small and neat, like a hairline fracture in a favorite mug. Invisible to the casual eye, but I could feel it in my hands when I held the phone. Something in me shifted, not from surprise, but from recognition. It had started. The slow forgetting. The days blurred into one another. There was no need for clocks anymore. Thomas woke when the birds did, and I followed. I learned to time his medications by the way the light shifted through the front windows. Morning pills with tea. Noon pills with canned soup. Night pills with a hand on his chest, counting each breath. I didn't mind it, not really. It gave the hours shape. When his legs began to swell, I propped them up with firm pillows and sat near his feet, knitting without rhythm. He liked the sound of the needles. Said it reminded him of rain. I kept Dean and Natalie updated. Or tried to. I'd send a photo now and then, Thomas holding up the crossword with a shaky smile, the dog asleep in his lap. I sent one of him holding the family album. I captioned it, "Still remembers every name." Natalie reacted with a heart emoji. That was all. Dean replied, "Tell him to stay strong. Gotta go into a meeting." There was no follow-up. No call. Just those clipped responses, cheerful, efficient, and utterly empty. I found myself reading them over and over, as if I'd missed something human in them. But there was nothing. They had the weight of paper napkins. One night, Thomas fell trying to reach the bathroom. His legs simply buckled. I managed to catch part of his weight, but we both ended up on the cold floor. I called Natalie. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, breathless, "It's your dad. He fell. I don't know if I can lift him again." No response. I texted Dean. A single line, "He collapsed tonight. Please call." He wrote back in the morning, "That sounds scary. Hope today's better. Let me know if you need anything." But I didn't know what I needed. I needed them here. That wasn't something I could put into words, apparently. They started contacting me only when they needed things. Dean asked if I could dig up their old tax documents, something from 2004. Natalie asked for my recipe for zucchini muffins, then a scanned copy of Grandpa's war medal for her youngest school project. Each time I replied promptly, like a good secretary. I'd sit with Thomas after, reading to him from the letters he used to write me in our early years. He always signed them, "Yours, T." Now he couldn't hold a pen. One day, I noticed something quiet in him had disappeared. He watched the fireplace without blinking, and when I asked what he was thinking, he said, "I used to think we were loved." I didn't know what to say. I folded his laundry slowly that afternoon, smoothing the fabric as if that would somehow stitch things back together. There were sweaters with worn elbows, socks gone thin at the heel. All the small repairs of a life, still trying to be useful. In the evenings, I stopped sending messages. I still picked up the phone once or twice, fingers hovering over their names, but I always set it down again. One morning, the mail brought a card from Natalie, a generic "thinking of you" card with a printed verse and her name scrawled at the bottom. No message. No date. Just her name, like a stamp. I kept it in the drawer beside the tissues. The hospice nurse, May, started coming twice a week. She was kind but hurried. Always asking if the kids had come yet. I stopped answering. She'd glance around at the absence of photos or flowers and say, "They must be busy." Busy. The word burrowed into me like a tick. It became a kind of refrain in my head. They're busy. They're busy. As if that excused the fact that they were letting their father die with only one witness. The ache in me wasn't sharp, not the kind that makes you scream. It was hollow. Like sitting in a room that used to be filled with music and realizing you can't even hum. Some nights, I'd wake up to find Thomas staring at the ceiling. His breath wheezy, the air thick with unsaid things. I'd ask, "Are you in pain?" and he'd shake his head. Then he said, very quietly one night, "They were good kids once." Weren't they? And I nodded. Because they were. Dean with his science kits, Natalie with her endless notebooks. They used to climb into bed with us during thunderstorms, all elbows and knees and sleepy breath. They used to love us. Or at least they knew how. Maybe love fades. Or maybe it morphs into something less recognizable, something more convenient. Once, I overheard Thomas trying to leave them both a message. His voice wavered, searching for steadiness. He ended with, "I just wanted to hear your voices." He didn't get a reply. That night, I sat on the porch after he'd fallen asleep and stared at the stars. The cold air stung my cheeks. Somewhere an owl called out, and I found myself wishing for the sound of my son's laughter, the way it used to echo through the woods when he was 8, chasing fireflies with Natalie by his side. But those sounds were long gone. What remained was the hum of the refrigerator, the steady tick of the wall clock, and the slow, deliberate silence of people who had turned away. I whispered into the dark, "We don't matter to them anymore." And the wind, kind thing that it is, didn't argue. It was early April when the last frost melted off the window panes. Thomas had stopped eating by then. Just water, sips at a time, from a chipped ceramic mug that used to be his favorite. I warmed it before filling it. It made no difference, but I did it anyway. He'd become so thin I could feel every bone in his back when I adjusted the pillows. The hospice nurse called it the final slide. She said it with practiced softness, her hand brushing my shoulder as though that could make the words hurt less. That morning, as I adjusted his blankets, he reached out with a trembling hand and placed something into mine, a folded piece of paper. Not sealed. Just worn and thin from being handled too often. His voice came out cracked, almost inaudible. "Read it when I'm gone." "Not before." I nodded. Held it like it was glass. I wanted to ask questions, but he closed his eyes. That was his way. He always finished things before I was ready. That night, he seized. I had just stepped into the kitchen for his evening pills when I heard the sharp thud, the chair jerking forward, the sound of breath caught in his throat like a bird trapped behind glass. I ran. My knees buckled as I caught his face in my hands. "Thomas," I said, once, twice, a dozen times. He didn't respond. His body tensed, then slackened. I called Dean. My hands shaking so badly I could hardly tap his name. He answered after the 4th ring. The noise in the background sounded like clinking glasses and laughter. "Mom," he said, distracted. "Can this wait?" "I'm at dinner." No, I said, breathless. He's dying. I need you here. Please. A pause. Then, Mom, I can't just drop everything. We've got a launch next week. This whole quarter depends on it. I didn't argue. I didn't even hang up. I just placed the phone down, flat, on the table. I called Natalie. It went to voicemail. I tried again. On the third try, she answered, her voice muffled by wind and chatter. I'm in Tulum, Mom, she said. With the kids. Flights are a nightmare. What's going on? Your father, I said. He's going. There was silence on her end. Then, I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't know it would be this soon. I'll try to come next week. Maybe. The call ended. I sat beside Thomas and held his hand. He wasn't speaking anymore. His breath was shallow, each inhale a thread pulling taut. At 3:17 a.m. he died. His chest rose one last time, then stilled. No drama. No gasp. Just a gentle surrender. I didn't cry. Instead, I washed his hands with warm cloths, trimmed his nails, and combed what little hair he had left. I changed his gown. Lit the candle from our wedding, the one we'd only used once, on our 30th anniversary. By morning, the house was still. Cold light crept in through the curtains. A thin hush settled over everything, even the clocks seemed quieter. The hospice team came. They were kind. Efficient. One of them touched my shoulder and said, "He went peacefully." I nodded, though I wasn't sure if that was true. Peace isn't just about stillness. The funeral was 2 days later. I had it at the little chapel where we'd married. The same wooden beams. The same cracked hymn books. Only the neighbors came. The postman, too. He cried. Said Thomas used to give him canned peaches in the summer. Dean and Natalie arrived late. Together. Natalie was dressed too lightly for the weather. Dean looked like he'd just left a conference. They sat in the back, didn't speak during the service, and left before I could reach them. They didn't ask how he'd died. They asked about the house. Dean pulled me aside near the coat rack. So, what's the plan with the property? Natalie chimed in, we were thinking, if you're feeling overwhelmed, we could help list it. Flagstaff's market is booming. I said nothing. Just looked at the chair Thomas had always sat in during communion, now empty. When they left, they didn't hug me. The house that night felt cavernous, though it hadn't changed in size. I poured myself a cup of tea I didn't drink, and stared at the piece of paper Thomas had given me. I unfolded it. His handwriting, faint and uneven, read. You gave them too much. I gave them too much. But you deserve the rest of your life back. I've set something aside. Use it however you want. Leave if you must. Don't wait for them to remember you. They already chose not to. There was an address listed. A bank in town. And one sentence that broke me. They didn't see me. But I saw you. I folded the letter slowly. Held it to my chest. For the first time since his death, I felt warmth, not joy, but a quiet flicker of recognition. Someone had seen me. I rose and lit another candle. Not for him. For me. Because I knew what came next. After Thomas died, the silence changed. It was no longer a companion but something heavier, shaped like absence. The kind that settles into corners and clings to the hems of curtains. I moved slowly through the cabin, not out of grief, but because I no longer had a reason to hurry. Meals were smaller. I still brewed coffee, though I never finished the pot. I didn't cry. I thought I would, but the tears wouldn't come. What came instead was a kind of stillness I hadn't known before, an emptiness not of despair, but of recognition. There was nothing left to beg for. I placed Thomas's candle on the mantel and let it burn until the wax collapsed into itself. I didn't trim the wick. I let it flicker, wild and uneven. That morning, I walked to the bank. The man at the counter knew Thomas. He guided me to a small office in the back and returned with a thin envelope and a wooden box. The envelope contained a letter, short, written in firmer strokes than the one I found before. It read, "This is for the life you never got to live. I couldn't give it to you while I was alive. But now you're free. Please be free." The box held a vintage leather-bound notebook and a cashier's check for $48,000. I held the notebook first. Inside were records Thomas had kept. Not financial ledgers, but memories he hadn't shared. A receipt for a tuition payment to Natalie's daughter's private school. Copies of checks he had written to Dean's failing business during the 2016 downturn. Notes about gifts sent in our names, signed as if from our children. Airline tickets he never booked for us, so they could afford their trips. Pages of calculations, how much he could pull from his pension without me noticing. Each entry was dated. Each sacrifice deliberate. He had been building a wall between me and the truth for years. Not out of deception, but to shield me from the slow decay of their regard. That afternoon, I sat on the porch with the notebook in my lap. I stared at the trees until they blurred into one another. Then I went inside and called the lawyer. I had always left the legal things to Thomas, but his name was still on the deed, and I knew what I needed to do. By the end of the week, the cabin was solely in my name. That same day, I opened the laptop we used to share and booked a one-way ticket to Vermont. A small town near a lake Thomas once described in an old postcard he kept in his sock drawer. He had always wanted to retire there. Said the air tasted like childhood. I didn't tell Dean. I didn't tell Natalie. I packed my suitcase, folded 3 dresses, my winter coat, and the framed photo of Thomas from our wedding day. I placed the notebook on top. I left the rest, souvenirs, photo albums, his worn slippers, where they belonged. By the time the trees began to green, I was gone. The cabin stood as it always had, quiet, modest, surrounded by pine. I didn't leave a note. I didn't give a forwarding address. There was no need. They hadn't come while he was dying. They wouldn't come now. The cottage I found in Vermont was small, with uneven floors and windows that stuck when you tried to open them. It backed onto a lake so still it looked like polished glass in the mornings. I rented it from a woman named Lillian who said, "It's not much, but it holds the light well." That first night, I stood by the window and watched the fog roll over the water. I let the silence settle again, this time without resistance. I belonged to no one in this place. No one expected me to be anything but quiet. 2 weeks later, the first message arrived. "Natalie, hey Mom, we didn't know he was that sick. Why didn't you say something?" I stared at the screen for a long time. She had seen my message. The voicemail. The picture. But the memory of omission is always easier than the memory of refusal. Dean emailed, "Can we schedule a Zoom to go over Dad's estate? We're a bit confused about the house situation. Let's clarify things soon." I didn't answer. They sent flowers. A white arrangement, expensive but sterile. I gave it to the woman next door for her daughter's graduation. Natalie called again. Left a voicemail about helping me downsize. I texted her the contact for a local junk removal company. I wasn't angry. I simply didn't see the need to pretend anymore. They had made their choices. Not out of malice. Just convenience. But love cannot survive long under the weight of convenience. That was something Thomas never said aloud, but I could read it in the margins of his notebook. In the final entry, scribbled with a shaky hand. "I kept hoping they'd see you the way I did. They didn't. I'm sorry." I made tea that night and drank it slowly by the window. The lake shimmered beneath the moonlight, and for the first time in years, I didn't wonder if someone might call. No more voicemails. No more one-sided hope. Only stillness. Only me. The cottage was smaller than our cabin, but it was mine. I began each morning the same way, with tea brewed in an old steel kettle, and the sound of gulls skimming across the lake. I had found the kettle at a thrift shop in town, tucked behind a shelf of forgotten mugs. It whistled off-key, which I liked. There was something honest about it. The days took on a shape. I walked to the post office twice a week. Read in the afternoons. I bought a small writing desk from a woman selling antiques out of her barn. She helped me tie it to the roof of my rental car, neither of us speaking much. I set the desk in front of the cottage window, where the light stayed longest. I placed Thomas's notebook in the drawer. I didn't open it every day. Just when I needed to remember that my quiet was earned. 3 weeks after I moved, I had a call from my lawyer. "Just confirming everything is finalized," he said. "The property is in your name, and the will was updated per your instructions. No contestations so far." He hesitated. "There's been some communication from Dean." I said nothing. "He wanted to know if you were of sound mind when you made the changes." That made me smile, gently. "I've never been more lucid," I said. That evening, I sat with my checkbook. There were no new names to write in it. No more monthly transfers. No tuition fees. No dental appointments. No private school contributions. The silence in my finances mirrored the silence I had chosen in my life. I remembered the last conversation Thomas and I had about money. He had whispered, "I'm sorry for making it easy for them to forget you." And I had pressed my forehead to his hand. I think he died knowing I would, eventually, stop waiting. 2 days later, I received a package from the old address. It had no return name, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Natalie's. Inside was a folder titled, "For Your Records." It contained a spreadsheet of expenses they'd kept on behalf of the family, neatly printed and itemized. There were notes in the margins. "Just FYI, Marissa says the kitchen remodel went over budget. Still waiting on reimbursement from that landscaping project." I folded it carefully and slid it into the fireplace. The next morning, I booked a local bank appointment and opened a new account. Just in my name. I deposited the check Thomas had left me. When the teller asked if I wanted to add beneficiaries, I said no. That afternoon, Dean sent an email. "Mom, it seems there's been a misunderstanding. The cabin's title doesn't show Dad's estate as joint ownership. We assumed, well, we thought it would come to us. Just trying to figure out how to proceed." I didn't reply. Instead, I made a copy of Thomas's notebook. Page by page. I put the original in the drawer and mailed the copy to my lawyer. In my letter, I wrote one line. "This is not revenge. It's record-keeping." A few days later, I walked to the bookstore in town. They had a bulletin board by the register, notes pinned with thumbtacks, announcing everything from babysitting services to watercolor classes. One yellow flyer caught my eye: beginners painting, Wednesdays at 4. I tore off a tab. On the first day of class, I showed up in my wool cardigan and brought a jar of buttons I thought might inspire a still life. The instructor, a young woman with soft hands and ink-stained fingers, handed me a blank canvas and said, "There's no wrong place to begin." That felt important. At home, I painted quietly. I wasn't good. My lines were unsteady, the colors muddied. But it was mine. In early May, I bought a plant from the farmer's market. A small lavender pot. I placed it by the window and watered it with an old jam jar. It bloomed in the sun and leaned slightly toward the glass. When the phone rang again, I didn't answer. Dean left a voicemail. "We just want to talk. It's been weeks. Please, Mom." I deleted it. Marissa sent an email with the subject line, "Let's help each other." I didn't open it. That evening, I took the last of Thomas's sweaters and washed them by hand. I folded them and placed them in a box marked for donation. I kept one, the gray wool one with the fraying collar. I slept in it that night. Rebecca texted once, just thinking of you. Hope Vermont is beautiful. I replied, it is. No more. I kept her number, but moved it under a new name in my phone, Gentle. When the first real storm rolled in off the lake, I sat by the window with the lights off and listened to the thunder. It didn't scare me. I knew what storms could take. And what they couldn't touch. By now, the cabin in Flagstaff would be empty. I had paid the property tax before I left. I knew they would try to sell it. I had already filed a preservation order with the town. Nothing could move without my signature. I wasn't hiding. I was just done being easy to find. I lit a candle beside the notebook and wrote on a blank page. No longer a mother out of obligation. No longer a financier. No longer a silent recipient. Just a woman with her own name in a house that smells of pine and paint. The next morning, I walked into town for bread. The grocer had started setting aside a loaf for me on Thursdays. You always come early, he said. I liked that. Not being missed, but being noticed. And that, more than anything, felt like power. It started with a voicemail. Natalie's voice was bright but strained. Hi Mom, just checking in. I know things have been difficult. We didn't realize how serious Dad's condition was. We'd love to talk. Please call when you can. I deleted it before it finished. 2 hours later, Dean sent an email titled, Clarifying Next Steps. He wrote, We understand that emotions were high. But we'd really appreciate a Zoom to go over the will and discuss the cabin. There are still many unknowns, and we want to make sure everything is handled respectfully and fairly. Respectfully. That word always shows up after silence has done its damage. I made tea and read the message again. I didn't reply. Instead, I walked down to the lake. The water was glassy, untouched by wind. Ducks gathered near the far bank, their backs slick with sun. I found a flat stone and let it rest in my palm before tossing it gently into the water. It sank without a sound. Later that day, a package arrived. White lilies. No note. The florist slip read, from your loving children. I brought them to my neighbor's daughter, who was celebrating her graduation. She arranged them in a mason jar and didn't ask questions. That evening, Natalie called twice. Then 3 times. By the 4th call, I muted the phone. A few minutes later, a message arrived, we really want to support you through this transition. Let's talk about how we can help you downsize. I sent her the contact information for a junk removal company in Vermont. I didn't add a note. The next morning, the lawyer called. Just letting you know, he said gently, they've started inquiring about estate details. I've explained the transfer of property was legal, valid, and final. There's nothing for them to inherit. I nodded into the silence. They seemed surprised, he added. I said nothing. That week, I continued painting. A bowl of limes. A teacup with cracks. My strokes were uneven, but the shapes began to make sense. I pinned the finished canvases on a string above the sink, clothespined like laundry. I didn't want to impress anyone. I only wanted to see my hands create something again. On Sunday, the church bell rang faintly in the distance. I didn't go. I sat in my robe with the newspaper, circling the weather forecast. Rain was coming. Good for the lavender. That night, another message from Dean. Mom, you're not answering. Can we at least set up a visit? It's been over a month. We've reflected. We want to reconnect. Let's talk. No apology. No acknowledgement. Just the vague shape of regret, hollowed by convenience. On Tuesday, I heard a knock. 2 knocks, then a pause, then one more. I opened the door to see Dean and Natalie standing on my porch. They had flown in, apparently. Dean wore a pressed shirt. Natalie carried a tote bag and wore sunglasses, though the sky was gray. Mom, Dean began, we're here to talk. I stepped outside and pulled the door closed behind me. Natalie looked around. This is beautiful. We didn't know you'd moved so far out. Dean shifted his weight. We've been thinking a lot. About Dad. About you. We know we didn't show up the way we should have. I stood quietly. We want to make it right, he added. Start over. Natalie nodded, her lip trembling. Please, Mom. I took a deep breath and looked at them, two adults shaped by distance, softened now not by love, but by the realization that something had slipped beyond reach. I called, I said softly. When he was dying. I called and asked you to come. You were busy. Dean looked down. Natalie blinked quickly. A month later, I continued, you realized something was missing. But that emptiness belongs to you. Not to me. I opened the door and stepped back inside. I already started over, I said gently. And I closed the door. I didn't slam it. I didn't lock it. I just let the wood settle into the frame, quiet and sure. They didn't knock again. From the kitchen window, I watched them stand there for a few moments. Then they turned and walked away. That night, I slept in Thomas's sweater. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters slightly, but I wasn't cold. In the morning, I saw a card slipped under the door. From Natalie. It read, "We miss you. Please reconsider." I set it aside, unopened. The lavender was blooming. I watered it slowly, watching the way the light shifted across the floorboards. There was nothing to reconsider. 6 weeks had passed since Thomas died. It was June now. The lake shimmered with early light each morning, and the air carried the scent of pine and something faintly sweet, honeysuckle, maybe. The days had stretched long, the way they always do when you stop waiting for someone to arrive. I had taken to walking before sunrise. Just me and the old beagle I'd adopted from the shelter, gray-muzzled, slow, gentle. I named him Tom. He slept near the fireplace and followed me with quiet devotion, never asking more than presence. One morning, just as I returned from the lake path, I saw them again. Dean and Natalie. Their rental car was parked awkwardly on the gravel, too close to the garden bed. They were standing by the front steps, dressed like they had tried to look casual but had each dressed for different seasons. Dean in a light jacket, Natalie in a summer dress and heels that sank into the soil. I didn't rush. I tied Tom to the porch railing, patted his head, and walked up the steps. "Mom," Natalie said, breathless, "we're sorry to just show up. But we couldn't leave it like this." Dean stepped forward. "We flew in last night. We wanted to talk in person. No more texts. No more confusion." They looked tired. Natalie's eyes were rimmed red, mascara smudged faintly under her lashes. Dean kept adjusting his cuff. I stood in the doorway, the sun behind me, casting their faces in the kind of light that reveals more than it hides. "Talk," I said, without invitation. "We've been thinking," Dean began, "and we know we made mistakes. With Dad. With you. We should have come when you asked. We just didn't realize how bad it was." "It wasn't bad," I replied softly. "It was final." They fell quiet. "We want to fix this," Natalie said. "We've been reading grief books. Trying to understand. We thought maybe we could spend time here. Just talk. Cook together like we used to." I watched her face. She wasn't lying. She was just late. Dean cleared his throat. "We also wanted to understand the will. There were surprises. We weren't expecting the cabin to be out of reach. There it was. The edge behind the words. I lived in that house," I said. "Took care of it. Paid every bill. Sat beside your father while he faded one breath at a time. Alone." Dean looked down. "We didn't know." "No," I interrupted gently. "You didn't ask." Natalie stepped forward. Can we start over? Please? You're our mother. I looked at her. You said I wasn't family, I said. You said your vacation was just for family. Natalie's lips parted, as if searching for an answer that wouldn't come. You made a choice, I said. You both did. You chose absence. You chose silence. And now that there's something to miss, you've arrived too late. Dean ran a hand through his hair. We were overwhelmed, okay? We didn't know how to handle any of it. We're not perfect. I never needed perfect, I said. Just present. The wind stirred behind them. The tree swayed gently, as if the world itself were listening. Dean's voice broke slightly. So what now? You just shut us out forever? I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. I looked him in the eyes, slow and clear. No. I'm not shutting you out. I've just stopped leaving the door open. Natalie was crying now, quietly. I miss you, she whispered. I nodded. That may be true. But missing someone isn't the same as loving them. They stood there, like children who had wandered too far into the woods and suddenly realized they didn't know the way back. Dean took a step closer. Is there really nothing left? There's always something left, I said. But it's mine now. I turned and opened the door behind me. I paused, hand on the knob. I don't hate you, I said. I just don't wait for you anymore. Then I stepped back inside. I locked the door. Not out of fear. Out of finality. They stayed on the porch for a while. I watched from the kitchen window as Dean paced and Natalie sat on the steps, her head in her hands. Tom lay curled at my feet, unconcerned. Eventually, they left. Their car drove away, tires crunching over gravel. And the cottage was quiet again. That night, I didn't light a candle. I didn't reread the notebook. I didn't check my phone. I poured myself a glass of water, folded a small towel for Tom's bed, and stood for a while by the window. The lake glimmered under the moon, undisturbed. In the silence, I felt something click gently into place. It wasn't victory. It wasn't revenge. It was the quiet release of what had once held me back. And I felt, finally, alone. But not lost. Just free. The season turned without fuss. The leaves thickened, green and full, shading the cottage in soft hush. I kept the windows open most days. The wind moved through the rooms gently, like someone familiar returning without knocking. I no longer expected the phone to ring. My mornings began with the same cup of tea, Earl Grey, no sugar, and a quiet walk down the path by the lake with Tom. He grew slower with each week, his hips stiffening, his snout resting lower as he walked. I didn't mind. We stopped often, letting the morning come to us. One Tuesday, I joined the local hiking club. I wore my old boots and packed a thermos of tea in my knapsack. The group met at the edge of the trail, 10 of us, mostly women, mostly quiet, and we walked single file, like a thread pulled through the forest. No one asked too many questions. There was room for breath, not stories. Afterward, we sat on a fallen log and shared sandwiches. One woman, Ellen, offered me a boiled egg and said, I was married for 39 years. I didn't know what silence was until he was gone. I smiled. I didn't know what silence was until they stopped speaking to me. She nodded and didn't press further. That evening, I wrote in a small notebook of my own. Nothing dramatic. Just small observations. Tom barked in his sleep today. The sky turned pink at exactly 7:12 p.m. My knees don't hurt when I take the lower trail. The cottage had settled into me. I repainted the front door pale blue. I hung a clothesline behind the house and clipped my sheets to it. They smelled like wind and sun and nothing else. I started baking again. Banana bread, zucchini muffins, biscuits that didn't rise but still tasted of comfort. I brought them to the neighbors in wax paper parcels, left them on porches with small notes, enjoy or no need to return the plate. No one asked about my past. In return, I never asked about theirs. I adopted a rhythm. Mondays for laundry. Wednesdays for painting class. Thursdays for the farmer's market. Sundays for writing at the desk by the window. I planted wildflowers behind the cottage, poppies, cornflowers, yarrow. The seeds were slow to take, but one morning I saw the first shoot press through the earth. I didn't keep a calendar. I didn't need one. Time was no longer something to mark, only something to sit inside. I had one photograph of Thomas, framed and placed on the mantel. It was an old one, from the early years, his hair dark, his smile crooked, a shadow of something mischievous in his eyes. I didn't talk to it. I didn't light candles beside it. I simply let it be there, watching. I no longer checked for birthday messages. There were no cards that year. No calls. Not from Dean, not from Natalie. Not even from the grandchildren. The silence was no longer a surprise, only a confirmation. I didn't resent it. There was a peace in not being needed. I stopped rereading old texts. I deleted the saved voicemails. I cleared out the drawer where I had once kept every Mother's Day card. They didn't feel like artifacts anymore. Just paper. In town, I became known simply as Marianne. Not Mrs. Bramble. Not Mom. Not Grandma. Just Marianne. I liked that. No one brought up my children. No one asked if I was waiting for visitors. They spoke to me about the weather, about the best apples in the orchard, about the new librarian who always shelved fiction before nonfiction. The kind of conversations that meant nothing and, somehow, everything. I began to sleep better. No more waking in the middle of the night, heart racing with the echo of a forgotten call. No more dreams where I opened the door only to find an empty porch. I painted a still life of Tom sleeping, his ears flopped like old fabric. I hung it in the hallway. I smiled every time I passed it. One morning, I stood by the lake and whispered, "I'm here." Not to anyone. Not even to Thomas. Just to the air. And it felt true. It was early October when the letter arrived. No return address, but I knew the handwriting. I'd watched it grow from schoolgirl curls to hurried adulthood, sharp, slightly leaning, overly neat. Natalie had always prided herself on her penmanship. The envelope was pale cream, heavier than standard, as though the weight of the words inside needed something more substantial to hold them. I didn't open it. I placed it on the small table by the door and went about my day. Fed Tom. Pulled weeds from the wildflower patch, now mostly dried and bowed from the coming frost. The wind had grown cooler, and I took out the heavier cardigans from the chest at the foot of my bed. By mid-afternoon, the letter was still there, its presence growing louder in its silence. I made tea and sat near the fireplace, the envelope resting on my lap like a guest I wasn't sure I'd invited. I traced the return address, none, and the postmark, Flagstaff. Finally, I slit it open with the blunt edge of a butter knife. No rush. No ceremony. Inside, a folded page. Handwritten. No greeting. I want to visit. Just the two of us. I miss you. Please write back. That was all. No explanation. No apology. Just a desire. A request. I folded the letter again and walked to the fireplace. The fire was low, still glowing from the morning's embers. I slid the letter in gently. The paper caught quickly, curling in on itself like something ashamed. I watched it burn. Then I whispered. Some bridges don't burn by accident. They burn because someone lights the match and walks away. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even hurt. I was simply steady. The next day, I bought a new sketchbook. My paintings had grown bolder, not better, just more certain. I painted the lake in the early morning, the edges softened by mist. I painted the beagle's paw, curled beneath his chest like a closed fist. I painted my hands, lined, veined, still. That week, I found myself humming as I swept the floors. Just a low tune from a song I didn't remember fully. Something from my mother's records, maybe. I liked the way it filled the space. I began taking long walks before dinner. The sun dipped early now, casting long shadows across the gravel road. No one drove down it but the postman and a boy on a rusted bicycle who always waved without speaking. One evening, I found a small package on my porch. No label. Just a box wrapped in brown paper. Inside, a bundle of photos. Old ones. Dean in his graduation robe. Natalie holding her first baby. A family trip to the coast, all of us barefoot in the sand. And at the bottom, a note. We thought you might want these. We're sorry. No name. But I knew the handwriting again. I didn't burn the photos. I didn't display them, either. I placed them in a drawer and shut it gently. That night, I cooked lentils with garlic and rosemary. I lit one candle. I read from a novel I'd forgotten I owned. Tom snored lightly beside me, his belly rising and falling with each breath. There were no more phone calls. No emails. Just that one flicker, that single flare of return. And I let it pass. The truth was, their regret belonged to them. Not to me. I had spent too long clutching hope like a coin that never bought what I needed. Now I moved through the world differently. Not hardened, but whole. In town, people had begun to know my name without questions. The grocer saved me the last loaf. The librarian put aside a copy of a poetry collection she thought I might enjoy. The woman from painting class invited me to her garden to see the late blooms. I said yes. Not out of loneliness. Just curiosity. Sometimes, when I walked the lake's edge, I'd see a pair of ducks gliding in unison, close but not touching. And I'd think of Thomas. Not with ache, but with a kind of warmth that settles in the bones. I didn't need to retell our story. It was enough that I had lived it. And now, I was living another. Alone. But never abandoned. Not anymore. The lake froze in November. A thin skin of ice spread over the surface like memory settling, not sharp, but firm. Each morning, I watched the frost crawl up the window panes, the sky bruised with early blue. Tom slept longer now, his breath shallow but even. We moved slower, together. I didn't decorate for the holidays. Not out of sadness, simply because the quiet felt complete on its own. No tree, no lights, no cards taped to the cupboard. I lit a single candle each night and sat by the fire, a book open on my lap, unread. One evening, as the snow began to fall, soft as sifted flour, I opened Thomas's notebook for the last time. The cover was worn smooth where my thumbs had touched it too often. I flipped past the pages I'd memorized, the quiet sacrifices, the kept silences, the ledger of love disguised as giving. At the back was one blank page. I picked up my pen and wrote. Love is not proven by blood, it's proven by presence. Then I closed the notebook, gently, and returned it to its drawer. I didn't expect to open it again. That night, I sat by the window with my tea. The moon cast a thin sheen across the snow, everything softened, hushed. I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall, the low creak of the cottage beams adjusting to the cold. No sounds of voices. No calls. No demands. Just the life I had made, small, steady, mine. In the distance, I heard the cry of an owl, one long note stretched across the dark. I raised my cup in its direction. To Thomas. To the version of motherhood I had given, and the woman I had quietly become when no one was looking. To the freedom that came not in escape, but in refusal. I drank. And for the first time in many years, I felt complete.